Hub family, welcome to another special edition of the Hub. All things for us with your boy Damon Reynolds. And listen, I am excited about this next episode because it is covering something that I think is vitally important for people of African descent in this country. I'm talking about. Let somebody else tell you.
Every mountainside, let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania.
Well, if that didn't explain it, family, this is probably one of the most controversial topics. And in the last election, you probably heard things like the economy talked about, the border, abortion, all of these different things. And they're very important, but I believe this topic was equally as important. And I might need to rewind back to 2016 when our dear brother Colin Kaepernick was actually in the midst of a lot of controversy surrounding his expression and his protesting on the field. Check this out.
What would you like this to be the end game for you?
That's basically. Ultimately, it's to bring awareness and make people realize what's really going on in this country. There are a lot of things that are going on that are unjust, people aren't being held accountable for, and that's something that needs to change. That's something that, this country stands for: freedom, liberty, justice for all. And it's not happening for all right now.
Well, family, if you haven't guessed it by now, I'm talking about freedom of speech. That's right, family, freedom of speech. Now, family, this has been a huge topic in the media circuit and in the political circuit, really for years and years, but specifically recently, we've seen a lot of things happening on college campuses, for example, where students are protesting what's happening in Israel and Gaza. But not only that, family, freedom of speech is important for many reasons. We saw many of our ancestors in this country who at the time who couldn't do things like vote, who were at times counted for protesting. Their right to demonstrate and their right to do all of these things that made transformations in our political systems, in the systems that we know today, all happened because we had the right to freedom of speech. So family, I don't want to take too long because I'm no expert on this, but I do have somebody who I know is an expert, and I'm excited to bring them out to you. Family, I want you to know I'll be talking to a brother by the name of Emerson Sykes, who is an attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union. That's kind of a tongue twister. Say it with me. American Civil Liberties Union. But family, this organization fights for the rights of many, but also as I talk about freedom of speech, family, this is something that is not just a standalone for the things that I agree with, but also for the whole world. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you to Emerson as he tells us the ins and outs of what freedom of speech is, how it's under attack, and why it's so important to everybody and for it to continue to be exercised and fought for. Family, I want y'all to check this out. See y'all soon. I'm going to go ahead and welcome in Emerson Sykes. Before he jumps in, he's a senior staff attorney with the ACLU. And so he is a huge fighter for one of the most important rights in the Constitution, which is freedom of speech, the First Amendment. And so we really appreciate the work that he does. He's had extensive work in Africa, where he was a legal advisor for the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. And also in that role, shout out Africa, he provided technical legal assistance to the civil society leaders, the government officials, students, and other stakeholders from across Africa to improve the legal framework protecting freedom of association. And so I'm excited, man. We're going to talk about a lot more of his credentials throughout this episode. But first, man, I just want to ask you, how are you, Emerson?
I'm hanging in there. It's a busy season. The holidays are coming up, but I can't complain. Things are good.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, man, I want to start by giving folks an idea of how I met you. So I came across you at the University of Richmond. I had a chance to sit in attendance at a panel that you were a part of with Killer Mike and some other well-esteemed guests. And I remember extensively, one, Killer Mike was talking about, of course, how freedom of speech is being impacted in music and art.
and then you all also shared on that. And I remember you had just some kind of really great responses. And so I would do a disservice if I didn't ask you, how did you, one, just get into being somebody who advocates for human rights?
Thanks for the invitation, and then also thanks for the question. I think I would, take it back to my parents' influence in terms of exposing me to politics and history, especially Black history, history of activism, the civil rights movement, the emancipation movement. And so I think from a very young age, I had a sense of sort of what it meant to contribute to social change. And I grew up very close to a family from South Africa, and a Black family from South Africa. And we were essentially like, two families, but we were one family. And so they were actually in exile. They had been anti-apartheid activists, and this was the late 80s, and they were in exile. And so in 98, right before I went to high school, I got to go to South Africa with them right after the fall of apartheid, and just seeing what it was like to be in a place that had suffered so much under such a repressive legal system under apartheid, and seeing what kind of hope and change was possible with a legal revolution. I mean, there were a lot of parts of the revolution, but one of the things that changed was all the political and legal structures. And of course, South Africa today is a complicated place. It's got a lot of challenges, but it was also foundational for me to see that change is possible. It's not easy, it's not perfect, it's not, the end of the story, but dramatic social and political change is possible. And so from there, I was sort of on the road to sort of wanting to figure out how to contribute. And so the idea of how to do this work refined and changed over time, but that was sort of the seed when it was planted for this general orientation, I would say.
Wow. Man, interesting enough about your story as well. Thank you for sharing, number one. And then two, my wife and I actually had the chance to travel to South Africa for the first time this past summer. But also, because I know you have some ties to Africa as well, we were in Kenya, Nairobi,
nice.
Particularly right as the protests had broke out earlier this summer. And so we saw, I guess, the state of free speech in a place like Kenya, where folks were being kind of repressed for posting things to Twitter. And as a result, they were showing up to the streets, they were galvanizing together, but then you saw government officials actually sending police out to find those folks who were posting, which was interesting to see that in a different part of the world.
Yeah.
And so I would,
No, I was just going to say, in my previous role, it was exactly that we were working on. So
wow.
From 2013 to 2018, I was working with an organization called the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. And we worked globally on freedom of association. That's the right to form organizations, basically. Non-profit organizations, non-governmental organizations. Freedom of assembly, meaning the right to protest, take to the streets. And freedom of expression, meaning the right to speak and to express yourself, whether it's through music, online, in person, comedy shows, books, all those types of things. And so for almost 6 years, I worked in dozens of African countries, trying to protect folks exactly in those situations, right? The folks who are protesting in the streets and the police are sent after them. The folks who are criticizing the government on the internet and the police are sent after them. The folks who are protesting environmental degradation and companies' security guards are going after them. So those were the types of issues that I was working on in my previous job. And it was 2018. I'll transition to talking about the ACLU. Is that all right?
Yes,
So
please.
in 2018, I had been doing, that was basically my dream job since I was a little kid, to be working and helping African human rights activists and traveling and learning about new places and new people. It was a dream job. At the same time, in 2018, Donald Trump was president the first time, my wife and I had our second child, and I was passionate about working with all of these human rights activists who were fighting against tyrants in their home countries. But I started to feel like maybe it was time for me to take a turn being a human rights activist fighting tyrants in my own country. And so I still think that international work is important. I tried to do it with humility. I tried to do it without telling people what to do, but rather sort of embracing our global humanity, and we can all help each other. But in any case, I decided, the ACLU was also looking for someone to take on free speech and racial justice with equal passion, because they are so often in tension, and we so often speaking to one audience, sort of the pro-free speech audience. They can be very skeptical of racial justice arguments and the racial justice. And when we talk about racial justice, those audiences tend to also have some skepticism about free speech. And from my work, from my life, and from my work, I am not equally, but I am passionate about both racial justice and free speech. And I'm sort of dedicated in this role to helping folks think through, navigate, as well as litigate, bring actual cases to try to vindicate both of these goals.
Yes. Emerson, thank you. Before we get into just the current challenges around free speech, I did some digging around and some research, and I previously saw that one of the important things you had listed in a separate interview was when we look at the First Amendment, we have to pay attention to that first word, which is Congress. And so I would love if you could just kind of delve into that for me and why it's important for us to understand what it means by it, because we see Congress shall make no law, but what are we really supposed to be seeing and hearing when we hear that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the First Amendment is a few short words. It's not very long, but it obviously has a huge impact on our culture and our society. And it's different than many other legal systems. The sort of way that we treat free speech in the United States is generally thought to be more protective. That is, we allow more speech here than almost anywhere else. And so obviously we deal with the consequences of that. But one of the reasons that that's true, or one of the things that I always like to point out, I'm a constitutional lawyer, I'm a professor of law as well. So I would be remiss if I didn't, go to the text. And as you mentioned, the first word of the text is Congress, right? It's Congress shall make no law. And then it lists the 5 freedoms that it cannot restrict: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. International human rights, African human rights mechanisms, the International Covenant on Human and Peoples, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which enshrines a wide variety of human rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. The Universal Declaration of International Human Rights, the African Charter on Human and Peoples' Rights. All of these legal documents enshrine and protect generally freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. But they talk about all people have these rights, or everyone has the right to freedom of association, or the First Amendment does not say all people have the right to free speech, or everyone has the right to freedom of religion. It says Congress shall make no law, right? It's actually about a limitation on the government's ability to regulate private speech. The idea of free speech, of free expression, is much broader than that. But the First Amendment itself is only implicated, it only applies when you have a government regulating private speech, right? So Congress doesn't just mean, Congress, the House of Representatives. It means broadly any government official, right, at the state or federal level. So when they say Congress shall make no law, it means government shall not restrict these 5 freedoms. And we can talk about what that actually means in practice, all of the tests that apply, how do we evaluate whether the First Amendment has been violated. But this fundamental question in the United States is always, if you want to talk about the First Amendment, the question is there a government actor restricting private speech. And if not, then the First Amendment doesn't apply.
Mm, mm.
So it's why, for example, public universities regulating protests is implicated by the First Amendment, because a public university is Congress for the purposes of the First Amendment. They're the government. Private universities, by contrast, are not generally bound by the First Amendment. In California, there's a thing called Leonard's Law, which kind of applies the First Amendment to private colleges. But other than that, as a general matter, private colleges might have their own reasons and policies for respecting free speech, but they're not, strictly speaking, bound by the First Amendment, because they are not the government. They are not public officials. It's also another common sort of example of the implication of this is it's why Twitter, X, Facebook, they have their own First Amendment rights, right? They are the private speakers in this situation, and they are protected by the First Amendment from excessive government regulation. So they are not the ones who are violating people's free speech under the First Amendment, because X, Facebook, they are not the government. They are not bound by the First Amendment. They are protected by the First Amendment.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of, as I paint this picture, even look at some of the work you've extensively done across college campuses. And of course, we have to get into what's most current, which is the fact that Donald Trump is once again elected president. But even more important than that is that I didn't see too much talk about this issue during the elections. And that was a challenge for me. There was a lot of more polarizing things that were on the surface, but I didn't see enough. I've talked to folks around me just practically, like, hey, do you know that your freedom of speech is being impacted? And they're like, well, I haven't really thought about it. And so with that in mind, I wanted to just bring people to know that even on campuses, Donald Trump is talking about, when it comes to the issues in Israel and with Gaza, and seeing how he's talking about deporting students who are actually protesting, which that is a part of this conversation. Can you talk about why it's important for us to even, I guess, consider this in the equation of this conversation? Because now we have students who could be deported when he comes in office.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the protests on university campuses are not a new thing. Students have long led the way in terms of social movements and activism. So this is not the first time we've seen protests and crackdowns on protests on college campuses. But of course, over the last year and a few months, since October 7th, we've seen a particular wave of protests and responses. And so we at the ACLU have been active in trying to both inform protesters about what is and is not protected by the First Amendment, as well as try to remind college officials about what is and what is not allowed in response to protests, whether they are, strictly within the bounds of policies or not. One of the things that I'm constantly reminding folks is, not all types of peaceful protest are protected. Of course, non-peaceful protest is not protected, but even some types of peaceful protest are also not protected. So protected and peaceful are not exactly necessarily the same thing. And likewise for universities, just because a protest is unlawful or outside the bounds of a policy for some reason doesn't mean that they can do whatever they want in response, right? There has to be a moderated, graduated response with plenty of notice and plenty of warning and a proportional response, right? And law enforcement shouldn't be used just because folks stayed 10 minutes past when they said they were going to clear out, So these law enforcement should be a very last resort, only when there is an actual imminent threat to the safety of people. Not just like an encampment, for example, is not something that is protected by the First Amendment. You're not allowed to just stay in the middle of a public space for as long as you like. So I've had to talk to protesters and explain, like, that's, it's peaceful, but it is not necessarily protected for you to stay here as long as you feel like it. So you should expect the university to try to remove you at some point. But someone is sitting in a tent, even for an extended period, does not necessarily necessitate a SWAT team, right? Like that is not a threat to security, even though it's not necessarily lawful. It's not an imminent threat to security. So trying to help folks think through, what both as a legal matter and as a practical matter, what types of protests are allowed and not allowed, and then what types of responses are appropriate and not appropriate. And it's not necessarily as cut and dry as we might think on first impression. So in the universe of sort of protests on campus, we've been doing a lot of work to try to help folks navigate these things, and our affiliates have filed a lot of lawsuits trying to vindicate protesters' rights. So that's sort of aside from the Donald Trump issue, and that's sort of the things that existed last school year. It's slightly different this school year, but I don't think that this is like going away anytime soon. Like student protests are always an issue. Donald Trump himself, poses a grave threat to the right to protest for anyone who disagrees with him, right? We don't know exactly what he will do, but we expect that he will use the full force of the federal government and law enforcement to crack down on protests that are dissenting in any way from his agenda, both on campuses and off campuses, right? So that's something that we as the ACLU expect and are prepared for. That's something that we saw during his first administration, and we can only expect more of the same. So, that is part of our broader preparation. I think, the ACLU has been for over a year prepping for the possibility of another Trump presidency. And we've identified a variety of priority issues throughout our organization. We cover a lot of different issues at the ACLU. I think we all assume that our immigrants' rights team and our reproductive freedom team, our LGBTQ team, will be on the very front lines and the most under threat. We know that he will do, he's promised immigration roundups on day one, and so we will be there to respond and we will be prepared. But we also have identified specific threats to free speech that we fully expect. One, as I said, is the use of the federal forces against protesters. Another is surveillance of those folks, pressure on the press, and crackdowns on freedom of speech of journalists. So there's a variety of different things that we are looking at and preparing for. Another issue that I've been working on a lot is bans on inclusive education. So like anti-CRT laws and those types of things is something that we have been dealing with since his first administration, right? He issued an executive order that actually was short-lived. The executive order was thrown out by a federal court, and Joe Biden rescinded it his first day in office. But this executive order on quote-unquote divisive concepts has been copied and pasted into hundreds, if not thousands, of laws and policies across the country, and we've been fighting them ever since. So we expect that to come back as well. Efforts to attack DEI and CRT and all these sorts of things, we're also very much preparing for and expecting. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question, but
no, I think this is great. I'm looking to, part of what my platform is looking to do, I want to arm people with the right information, and so a lot of folks don't understand. They walk outside and they're like, well, I need to be able to say whatever I want. And I'm like, well, freedom of speech is so much more than that. And so even if, in considering, of course, the new election, the different realms that we see freedom of speech and freedom of expression sort of being attacked or dismantled in, whether that's art, which is another separate conversation. Just seeing the recent case of the rapper Young Thug, and he has a case, and I think he's out, but I mean, he spent almost over a year, almost 2 years dealing with the fact that music, somebody who chooses to put something in their art, you can be tried for that. And folks can take that seriously. So that's extremely serious. And I would even ask, this is probably a broad question, but I think it's an important one. What is the danger and folks not realizing or even joining this fight for freedom of speech in the First Amendment? What is the danger in us not recognizing some of these things that are taking place?
I think, the reason there's two primary justifications, I think, for protecting freedom of speech, right? One is that it is an inherent human right. It's something that we all, as human beings, have a need and a want to express ourselves and to communicate. We're social animals. And so this sort of intrinsic value in protecting the individual right to express themselves, right? That is good enough on its own. In addition to that, the only way that we can have social progress is if people are allowed to share opinions that differ from those who are currently in power, right? The only way we have change is if dissenting voices are allowed to be heard, right? That's why tyrants and dictators hate dissent, because dissent prompts change, and those who are against change are against dissent. And so anybody who fights for any cause comes back to the value of free speech, right? And so for folks who on the right felt like they were sort of losing the culture wars, and the left was in the ascendancy in some way, they sort of took the mantle of free speech to protect their right to express conservative values on campus, for example, right? That felt like the dissenting voice that needed to be protected, and therefore they took up the mantle of free speech. More recently, as you said, protesters on behalf of Palestinian human rights, many of whom come from the political left, many of whom came up with a skepticism of free speech and academic freedom because it had been used as a way to protect the right to say offensive things by white men, basically, right? That's how it had been rebranded. I'm oversimplifying, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Now we have folks, many of them people of color, many of them from the left, understanding that they need their free speech rights, right? It is them who now sort of are taking up the mantle of free speech, and many of those same conservative voices who had been the quote unquote defenders of free speech are now saying we need to silence these children, right? Lock them up. This is unacceptable behavior, right? So there has always been inconsistency on both sides in terms of free speech, right? So as the ACLU, we think it's important to defend free speech from attacks from all sides, right? Both because this is a right that we all have and we need to defend, and because we as a society cannot grow and flourish and change and evolve without it, right? So whether any individual chooses to participate in a street protest is up to them, right? There's a lot of strategic decisions. There's a lot of ways to contribute. My dad, may he rest in peace, used to say, he went to an Ivy League college. He came from a small town in Louisiana, a small city in Louisiana, and ended up at Harvard in the late 60s. And he told me the most revolutionary thing I could do was go to class. Right? So there's all sorts of ways of protesting. There's all sorts of ways of being an activist. There's all sorts of ways of making your voice heard and of contributing. So you said, what do you say to people who don't value their own free speech? Listen, it's not for me to tell everybody they need to be going out in the streets, but I think we should all understand that it impacts all of us when we let the government decide what is okay to say and what is not okay, even when you agree with that government. Right? Yeah. That's when the danger is especially acute. That's when the impulse to let them sort of run a little wild is when they're shutting down speech you don't like. But even when they're shutting down speech you don't like, your rights are implicated and your future ability to share dissenting views is implicated. So, I don't expect it to be everybody's number one issue. I don't expect everybody to be in the streets, but I think we all need to keep a close eye on those in power, from whichever party, because power is apt to abuse it if not checked.
Yeah. Wow. Great response, man. I've I've been one who's been a bit I won't say the word is nervous, but I've been a bit challenged by seeing some of the things that have come about over the cross election cycle. No matter who you voted for, I think a lot of people can say this was very, very strenuous and hard. It's somebody who either voted, it's somebody who's on the other side in a political party, whatever it is, it was challenging. And so I'm curious to know then, with all that in mind, I know one of the things that has come up is Project 2025. I'm not sure if you had to look completely into it or if you had a chance. I didn't read the whole thing, but I know a lot of it is centered around what I think the danger is if we don't protect something like this, which we could almost live in a dictatorship. And and so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts around Project 2025 and even just how it kind of connects to the work that you're doing with ACLU.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we have reviewed, and it informed our counter plans. We don't know how strictly they're going to stick to it, but certainly this idea of protesters and surveillance are highlighted in Project 2025. The other thing that I would just highlight, and it's not necessarily a classic free speech issue necessarily, but I think it's an integral, is the idea of sort of weaponizing, slashing and weaponizing the federal government, especially employees, right? So sort of the idea of cleansing the deep state, what one form that can take is firing people who don't agree with your politics or who express dissenting opinions. And this is not just in terms of, political appointees and cabinet members and leaders of departments. Of course, they need to be, in political alignment with the president in order for them to execute. We're talking about these lower level folks who have the actual expertise, who've been in these agencies for decades. They understand how things work. They understand how to make things happen. And the idea that they will all be subjected to some sort of political litmus test. These are folks who have served in multiple administrations through multiple changes of power and party and control of Congress and all those sorts of things. But if we have a departure from norms such that those folks are all sort of considered to be purely political employees, and that every rung of the federal government can be stacked with loyalists, the risk becomes grave, right? Because in some ways we rely on bureaucrats to sort of keep the gears of government running, but also serve as a check on those who want to sort of go outside of the normal processes. Removing that check by only allowing loyalists to work in the government, I think poses a grave threat that is often overlooked.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, man, and I thank you. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I'm curious to know, when we talk about international affairs, it keeps playing in my mind when I thought about your work in Africa. I think a lot of people don't think that stuff matters to this conversation, but we can learn a lot from the international affairs, because I mean, there are some things that I even think of South Africa's history when we spent time there, and we remember going into, I think it's Soweto. And of course, they have a long-standing history when the transition from, you had folks coming in, the Dutch, and teaching about Afrikaans. And I remember the young boy who was killed, but they were protesting back during that time. What did you learn? I'm just curious, from your time in Africa and how that's impacting how you even go about things now.
I mean, while I was working in sub-Saharan Africa, people would often sort of push back on the idea that it was in any way relevant to what was happening in the US, right? Like, African dictators do all kinds of nonsensical things that could never happen here. We have the First Amendment, we have the Constitution, we have political norms, we have a thriving economy. None of that could ever happen here. And of course, every country is different. Every country has its own history, its own political systems. No two places are alike, but also nowhere is immune. And history and freedom are not promised. And so I insisted that these were not apples and oranges, and as much as they are both countries filled with people, right? Of course, they have their own histories, but they're entirely possible that they can be similar and dissimilar in all sorts of ways. And so it is not in any way an I told you so or one that I relish, but the fact that things can get worse, things can get better, and things can get worse. And so what I learned from working in these countries was seeing political shifts and also seeing these moves of shutting down protests, shutting down the press, trying to use the military to enforce or to try to stay in power, which we cannot forget Trump attempted to do, and the military said no. I sure hope they will continue to do that. But these are all classic moves that have been used by dictators all over Africa for generations, right? And so I do think that that experience is highly relevant. I think I think we are all human beings trying to get along, and therefore the dynamics that develop among us can tell us about other dynamics among other people. But I don't mean to draw a one-to-one comparison that what happens in Kenya will happen here. Of course, they're dramatically different.
Right.
But at the same time, the efforts that it also shows us what happens when you don't have robust protections for free speech. That could, if we relent, if we allow excessive authority in the hands of government in the interest of order, this is exactly what can happen. What you saw, which is people get disappeared for criticizing the government on social media.
Wow. Wow. Well, Emerson, thank you. This is great stuff. I want to make sure that we get everything we need to know. Is there anything, just in terms practically, what people can be doing to stay informed, or also steps, anything that you want to put out there that people should know about in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, take care of yourselves. It's a holiday season. We got to recharge a little bit, and I think come January, it's going to be time for us to hold dear to the values and the people that we cherish, and to do as much as we can. I mean, none of us is going to be able to hold this country together on our own, but together we have to try.